on Phil's comment, and we've discussed this as well. I think early career researchers, it's a really key stage. I think how they are assessed and how we integrate open science perspectives, but all other perspectives, as you said, what we value into the assessment of early career researchers in particular, if that's done right, creates a culture shift, recognizing that they're the future research leaders. They're also, in many cases, future research managers. They're future reviewers of research. There are so many connections there that this is a really key area, and better integrating open science perspectives, but also how we assess teamwork, collaboration, integrity at an early career stage is really key. And on René's point as well, I think our survey showed what you were saying about assessment focused on outputs and less on the process. And if we were thinking of reimagining the system from zero, instead of starting at the last point in the research cycle, publications, working back as we have done to data, now some examples of open software, open hardware, you would actually think about starting from the other end. So opening the research process first, pre-registration, open methods, and working that way. And that would be a maybe more sustainable way to promote open science with a concurrent culture shift.
I mean, one of your question was whether or not the research assessment currently aligns with the values and principles of open science. If you look at the open science recommendation, the answer is clearly no. There is no question about it. Hence, the chair that is actually looking into how can you seriously look at the values that are there in the open science recommendation, precisely because they go beyond the traditional values of kind of traditional science processes. And then what do you do? It's a serious rethinking of the culture of science and the way we do science at different stages, of course, and definitely not only looking into the outputs, even more importantly, looking into the process of science. When do you engage, of course, within the scientific community, but at which point do you actually engage also with the society upon which you're going to have your impact? So it is, yeah, it's not aligned at all for the moment.
So I think I want to clarify. I did not say, it was not an open question about whether the current assessment practices aligns with open science or not. I am very well aware of the limitations, but there is a differences between alignment and directly misalignment. And my concern when we especially talk about habilitation-like processes and examination-like processes, that we have a direct misalignment, that we actually within the system has built in structures that blocks a change. And if that is the case, we have to address that directly, even if it is difficult, even if that requires going to the national legislation level and looking at that. And I am aware that habilitation and examination-like processes is a very European and only parts of Europe. It has some positive sides as well, because it is a structure at a national level that also allows to be a driver for open science practices and other academic values in the assessment processes. But I think it is interesting to take the OPUS framework and look at these structural assessment practices and see, because if we can change small things there, we can actually create quite a big amount of change. While if we go on a more close to the researcher level, we risk that it becomes very difficult to replicate another place. So there's a balance and both things are needed.
Yes, thank you. So on this alignment issue, since we are now at UNESCO and the criterion of equity is an important criterion, then clearly this alignment is not the case. I mean, again, if I want to criticize this called open access thing, I mean, it's very obvious that you need to bring some cash with you to publish. If you are not working at a university, you can a priori not publish. So it's very strange. Before we could do that. And to make things worse, I mean, like, for example, in my university, we have contracts with Springer and Elsevier. So, but if you want to publish with another author, you actually are incentivized to move to another institution because, you know, not everybody has contracts with everybody. So you get very strange incentives. I mean, you can imagine that people move now institutions because one university has a contract with a particular publisher. So it's crazy. So the equity is and of course, you know, the global level is, but I think there is something much worse behind it, in my view, for the system of science. And I think I did not highlight that, but openness is not only openness to resources, but also openness to actors. So, and that was part of our open science rationale, actually, in the European Commission at the beginning. And thanks goodness, this is still part of the excellence criteria. I mean, that was really a revolution to incorporate openness to other knowledge producers as part of your research assessment, as part of your assessment of proposals. I don't know whether they even do that in the Netherlands. I don't think so. But so this is very important. But this element also allows science to become more responsive to society, of course, because the exclusivity, I mean, we reinforce still the exclusivity of academic science at the cost of societal relevant knowledge production. So this is compensated by you know, making this a criterium as part of your excellence criterion, although still the whole idea of excellence is undefined. I mean, it's just part of the peer review process if nobody knows what it actually means. So this is why I always say we run in science at the same type of bankruptcy as the financial crisis. There we had the independence of the banks, and we should not have societal intervention, no political intervention in our banks because it will be a disaster. Well, we all know what happens, what the banks all did. And this is now happening to science, because scientists since the 1960s, they said, we know what science is. We don't want to have societal influence. Don't mess around with us. We know what is good science. And this is why they produce now rubbish. And of course, this is less societal sensitive than when you as an individual cannot get a loan anymore at the bank, but it's a similar process. So this exclusivity and this undefined, you know, self-referential criterion is very dangerous for any institution. And this is why I'm happy that actually my former employer has still this criterion, you know, that openness is not just openness to resources, but you have to work together with other knowledge producers beyond the academic sphere.
I just wanted to pick up on what René and Pil were saying. I think when we talk about research assessment reform, we tend to focus on the infrastructures that are broken within academia, like examination post-PhD or commercial publishing and things like that. But I think it's also really important to recognize that the infrastructure supporting open science are also changing and are also perhaps not fit for purpose for the UNESCO vision that we have in the future, that a lot of the open science infrastructures were built with transparency and reproducibility in mind, and they don't really work very well for equity. They don't work for societal actors. They don't work for low and middle income countries. And yet we are not talking about those. And if we need to critically reflect on research assessment, we need to not only start thinking about the obvious infrastructural challenges and the obvious procedural challenges that are problematic in research, but also as an open science movement, reflect back on what we've already built and continually question if these are reflecting the values that we are now thinking should be the driving forces for open science.
I'm going to open up the floor. Pil, I see a response. Please go ahead.
But I have to say, Louise, that's not just a question about building them into open science values. It's the whole, like the whole question about equitable opportunities and leveling the playing field, and whether we have that built into the research assessment or not. And I think we all know we don't. We have obstacles towards. That's much deeper than just a question about open science. That's a question about the whole rationale of higher education and research and of academia. So it's not, we cannot tie that to open science only. We have to tie it to the whole question about what role do the institutions play in the societies they are part of.
I mean, I totally agree, and I wasn't suggesting otherwise. I was just suggesting that sometimes as open science advocates, we tend to get a bit smug and position ourselves as the good guys and everyone else as the bad guys. And it's good to maintain our own self-reflection at the same time.
So we're smug rock stars. Yeah. Okay, so open science should be science done right. Okay, so we need to fix on to that. Let's come back to the leadership piece. So we have 7 amazing pilots that all put themselves forward. They are the trailblazers. They're people who have committed resource, time, effort. They've put themselves out there. And yet none of them chose any of the indicators or areas to do with leadership. Does that tell us something? I think, did it strike any of the panel? The other thing that I think is really important is that if we are relying on early career researchers, amazing early career researchers like PIL and all of the other ECR networks that are represented in OPUS to make that change, it's going to be 30 years. All of the training and interventions were aimed at ECRs. Nothing. Maybe with the exception of some of Elena and I'm guessing maybe some of the PIs were part of the training, but the vast majority of the trainings and the cultural shift and change was aimed at ECRs. That's not good enough. We're not going to change fast enough if we just rely on early career researchers to push it from the bottom up. So what do you, the panel, think we need to do to get that transformational change quicker than 30 years?
I mean, at the risk of sounding provocative, maybe talk to some established researchers as well, because I've been in the open science movement for quite a long time. And I mean, rightly, early career researchers do represent a community of researchers who are open to and receptive to these discussions. But I have seen over the years a lot of training initiatives focus exclusively on early career researchers because they assume that later career researchers are not going to be receptive. And if you're not going to talk to them and engage them in the dialogue, you're not going to change things. And in a way, it's dangerous to be positioning established researchers against early career researchers. You're reinforcing this divide of, the new guard and the old guard. I think try and get a mix in the room. And this came through in the OPUS project as well with the lessons learned, that having the mix in the room is really important. And in terms of leadership issues, I'm not surprised for 2 reasons. The first is that leadership training takes a long time. With high mobility of researchers, getting institutions to commit to meaningful leadership training and meaningful culture change training is very difficult. And I don't know how you do that. But the second thing as well is it's very difficult to monitor cultural change and individual value change. So I think we need to talk to a lot more psychologists about that.
One simple way would be to reward and recognize established researchers who are good ambassadors and who enable the early career researchers in their labs or in their offices to engage with open science or integrity or good research practice more generally. I think one great example of that from our membership is mentorship awards to established researchers who are excellent mentors within their national system. So really recognizing those practices at an established researcher level as well.
I guess my proposal will be very unpopular because I advocate a more indirect political intervention in how we deal with public investment in research. So, for example, if we now take the Netherlands as a country which is actually very advanced in open science, I think there still needs to be a dramatic overhaul. For example, the universities get what they call in Netherlands a lump sum, amount of money. You can do with it what you want. This is the idea of an autonomous university. That means, okay, we get the money, but don't tell us what to do with it, because we know best. So I think this model is out of date. Because what happens then is that you have 14 universities, they all get a lump sum and they start competing with each other on same issues. So this is completely counterproductive and a waste of money. So what I would propose is that you say, well, okay, you have, like you do also with hospitals, for example, which is also publicly funded, by the way. You let them specialize in particular missions, or, you divide it up. So what I say, the mission is actually the core element of how you want to evaluate research and fund research. So if you do that on mission basis, be it scientific missions or missions regarding societal challenges, you can divide it. And then you don't get the problem anymore of rewards and incentives in terms of, what now the poor early research careers have. I mean, obviously, if you are now a postdoc or something and you have fantastic data and somebody asks you, are you going to share it with others? Then you obviously will say, no, I would be stupid. Because I first published, so you have to wait a couple of years before you will get these data. I mean, it's completely natural. But if you, when it comes to publicly funded research, if you organize it around missions and fund researchers instead of giving lump sums autonomously to universities, but let them define first in which capacity to have to fulfill certain missions. So the criteria would be much different. It's more like whether they can fulfill a public mission, yes or no, and whether they are feasible to do it. And it's actually interesting, if you look now to evaluation of research proposals, any reviewer implicitly sometimes uses all these criteria, but although they are not formalized, because you have excellence, impact, and other stuff. But in the back of the minds, the reviewers always think, yeah, but can I do it? Do I have the capacity to do it? But this is the important element. And this is how you have to assess these missions. And then you leave it up to the units to say how the researchers are rewarded. I mean, it's not a big deal. But of course, this is not going to happen. And because universities, they will, and then you can see that now with Coera, they will, of course, hide themselves behind this, like, well, yeah, but we are autonomous. We know what is excellent. Don't tell us what is good science. We are the ones who decide on that. If you don't change that, then you will never get to open science.
Yeah, I may perhaps come with a little bit of a different perspective, because while it is important to also look at the academic leadership, I have to say that when we're talking researcher assessment, then most of them are early and mid-career researchers. That's where most researcher assessment happens, because it's your next career stage that is on the line. And tying back to what you say, James, in terms of rewards, for rewards really to matter, they have to be something that I can use. If I already have the permanent contract, then it matters less than if I am searching for my next salary. And it really ties to this with the research assessment. It really ties back into that the academic career is extremely precarious. And if we reform research assessment, we have to somehow, if it is to be sustainable, we have to somehow lower the precarity. And in doing so, because that will primarily affect early and mid-career researchers, in doing so, hopefully it will not just be those who stay within academia that takes this knowledge, these practices with them. It will hopefully also transfer out towards the rest of society. And this is what is also the case with early career researchers, that they are a connection to the society around because of how their career trajectory will take them. And so I don't in the same sense see it as a red flag that the main focus is on early career researchers and mid-career researchers. I think it is especially important that we remember to look at the mid-career researchers and look at what is the gatekeeper towards that permanent contract. Where is it lies, and at those assessment practices, whether they are in an habilitation-like structure, an examination-like structure, or not at all, just an open job call, what are the gatekeepers? Because if those gatekeepers don't take the rewards into account, don't take open science practices into account, then up until that point, I will have to prioritize what will get paid, like literally will pay my salary, not get me a loan because I am so precariously employed that no bank will give me a loan. But that's the connection that lies. The reward has to matter. It has to not be a nice diploma on my wall. I have enough of those. So sorry.
Okay, I'm going to shift this discussion to the floor more so. Brian, can you please identify yourself?
Hello, my name is Brian Cahill. I'm from the Marie Curie Alumni Association here, but I think my question is kind of closer to what Pil was just talking about. And from the I'm working as a managing director of a career program at Hochschule Bielefeld, which is a University of Applied Science. And in this program, we have about 40 postdocs, mainly working in tandem positions between industry and academia, so between practice, teaching, research. We also have part-time lecturers who are working in industry. And in this position that kind of we are preparing them to apply for the professorship at the University of Applied Science. And the minimum requirements are to have 3 years experience in industry and also enough experience of lecturing to be able to do the job. And kind of where this project, we concentrate on our postdocs, but we also concentrate on culture change within the institution. And this requires leadership from the presidency, but also very importantly from the deans of the faculties. And kind of these are the people who, at the end of the day, when it comes to academic hiring, are the gatekeepers. They kind of have to, they decide on how the position is going to be advertised and who is going to be in the commission that decides who's hired. And kind of where I look at kind of this framework that we've developed is how to integrate that in a process for application that does not overburden the applicants. Because when I look at our applicants, they are very overburdened already. They're very time poor. They're doing teaching, they're working in industry, they're doing research. They may have small kids at home. And so how to implement a process that doesn't bias against the people who are most time poor, those who have young children. And so this is because when I look at our program, we have more men in the tandem positions, which are 100%, kind of 50% in industry, 50% with us. And we have more women in the part-time lecturing positions, which are 25% or 50%. And there are reasons for that. And so that we have to really kind of look at this so that when we kind of implement these frameworks within hiring, that it doesn't bias against particular people within the practice. So I think I would like to ask kind of at the level of hiring, because we haven't heard much about that within the project, how this could be implemented at a meaningful level.
Who is in the hiring committee? Often that is set not just by the dean alone, but by a faculty council. And often the faculty council reflects some sort of academic community. And often those who are not included in that academic community is the early and mid-career researchers.
I would like to say the early and mid-career researchers are not included, but the students are.
Yes, and this is actually precisely my point, that we have an academic governance system that excludes the majority of researchers in Europe, the early and mid-career researchers, in the structural governance. And that is seen in such things as hiring processes. And that is why I ask for a seat at the table. It's simply for me, I need to be part of that conversation. We have changed the landscape of researchers and of how our academic careers look over the past 25 years. We have not changed the entry points into academic governance to match that. And it's a political decision to have changed the career structures. It's an academic decision to ensure that the entire academic community, also early and mid-career researchers, is included in the academic governance. And it doesn't mean that it doesn't mean that my vote should carry the same as the professor. It's okay that we have quotients, but it means that that constituency I come from needs to have a seat at the table.
We have another question from the floor. John, could you please identify yourself, maybe squeeze in between Brian there to get access to the microphone?
Happy to stand. Been sitting long enough. If anyone doesn't know me, then you should. And you might, and those who don't might regret it. John Crowley, representing Trust Inside in this project. I think there's something really important that's been implicit in a lot of what's been said, but that needs to be explicit. It's about the barriers to open science. And I think there's an assumption in nearly all the comments made that if the policy incentives and the policy structures were lined up in the right way, then open science would follow naturally, because everyone likes the idea and would like to participate. There might be some indifference in places, but not reluctance, hostility, or countervailing incentives or preferences. Now, within the project, and unfortunately this has dropped off the agenda of this meeting, we did some interesting exploratory work on trust in relation to open science, building on some literature which showed specific trust-related barriers to open science before the project even started, which is in one of the early deliverables, and then some rather experimental work developing a framework for analyzing trust within open science. The idea being that there are, of course, top-down incentives that shape systems, but there are also individual attitudes and perspectives, some of which have been referred to, but very much connected to the top-down incentives. They need to be looked at in their own right, so to speak, that might also affect the outcome. And then there are systemic effects, which are not about top-down incentives or about bottom-up commitments, but about how things operate sociologically to produce outcomes that no one in particular wanted and that everyone might actually regard as suboptimal. So policymakers can design better policies that will incentivize open science better. Will open science emerge as a result? And if not, why not?
Anna.
I don't have a response to your question in entirety, but we did see a little bit around the world what was happening with the adoption of the recommendation. We have more and more countries who actually started with policy development, whether on institutional or even at the national level. Policy alone, of course, is not enough. We've seen huge importance in infrastructures, and we don't spend enough time maybe talking about open science infrastructures and what does that mean, and what does that mean around the world, not just in a specific region. So infrastructures, extremely important. If there are no infrastructures, open science cannot happen. The other one is, of course, incentives, but even that is not enough. Capacity has to be there as well. So there's a lot of training that needs to be done and a lot of education. And it's not just, again, at the end of your kind of education, when you're already a researcher, you kind of have to embed some of these things earlier in the education system. So it is very, very difficult to push kind of the change that we want with open science if you haven't embedded these values and principles and the idea of why this is actually valuable from the beginning of, you know, the educational cycle, particularly for researchers. So it's, I mean, policy in and out of itself, really, we've seen it's not enough. And we have seen, actually, going to what Pil was saying, we have in many countries a lot of established researchers who are very open to open science, but it's actually the mid-career and early career researchers that are reluctant, not because they don't want to, but because they will not get the appropriate reward for it, and it will not help them in their careers. So we actually have the opposite of what was said here. So that's just a little bit of a glimpse of what we've seen in terms of what else is needed besides policies. And indeed, if you only have the policy and you don't have anything else in place, you have a huge pushback from all of the different communities that are involved in the implementation of open science.
I'm going to go back to the floor. Pierre, could you please introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you, Gareth. Yes, hello. I'm Pierre Winicki, founder of Trust Inside and associate partner with John. My point is that from what you described, it seems to me that, and actually the question of leadership was mentioned as a topic to be addressed. To me, from what I hear, it seems to me that what you're describing is a leadership based on distrust, a total distrust, probably at every level, all levels, at the floor level, I would say, up to the top level, which is the political level, top administration level, perhaps European level as well. And for example, based on some of the examples that you mentioned, for example, if I look at our model that we have been developing inside the project here at OPUS, which is the Tree of Trust model, some of you now know about it. Several components of this Tree of Trust are definitely addressed by the examples you raised. For example, René, the lack of co-responsibility when you're describing that the fact that many organizations, laboratories, universities are competing with each other instead of working together to make sure that not everyone does the same thing. That's a total lack of co-responsibility. But this lack of co-responsibility, the question of co-responsibility is not, unfortunately, inside our educational systems in any country. France, certainly not, for sure. What you describe raises also the issue of clarity and compliance with the rules of the game, not to mention the question of conflicts of interests. And the another one, acceptance of uncertainty, risk, and complexity, which leads to over control. So all these dimensions, concrete dimensions, are part of a culture of trust, and unfortunately are not addressed in the leadership program if they exist, and they usually do not exist. And I think that this leadership culture should be absolutely embedded into the training programs of scientists at the early level, as much as the pure science issues that they're learning, up to the top level of the organizations. And my last point is to wonder whether if you want to get the attention of top leaders, does someone have measured the cost of distrust in science? Because once you measure the cost of distrust in money or in political votes or whatever the indicators are to their, that they listen to, then they may make appropriate decisions, probably.
René?
No, I'm very happy that Pierre raised this point of co-responsibility, because in 2009, I think it was, I tried to advocate responsible research and innovation at the European Commission. Eventually, it also became part of the Horizon Europe. But in my definition of responsible research and innovation, the institutionalization of co-responsibility was an essential pillar, which I'm still also advocating in other directions. But this means that this goes back to, which we did not discuss in detail so much, is the other side of openness. So the openness towards other knowledge producers, and that we have to work together along, let's say, the triple helix chain. So academia, research, citizens, and industry working together on collectively, for example, on missions. And the interesting thing, what happens there, and this is what you also describe, Pierre, is that if you work together, if you collaborate, then you produce trust as a side thing. It's not so. In the context of collaboration, you have you produce trust. So it's very interesting that our society it is organized in a way that, for example, between executive branch of government and parliament, we have an institutionalized form of distrust. We distrust normally our government and we control them, and this is why we are call for openness and all kinds of mechanisms of control. Exactly, this is the result. So the call for openness is normally the call for control. Now, the interesting thing in our society is that in the science society relationship, science policy society relationship, we don't have an equivalent for that. We don't have an accountability mechanism for science. Nobody accounts science for this. So also calls for openness are rather useless because there are no control mechanism in this sense. But we have other mechanisms, and this is collaboration. So this is why and of course this means that if you want to institutionalize co-responsibility, that means that public actors or research councils or the European Commission has to become proactive in saying, okay, we define the roles of each of these actors in this process. And because that is not an equitable, normally the societal actors are not equitable. This is what we all want to achieve, especially at the level of UNESCO. So there you have to become proactive. So on this dimension, I think we have not done enough. But I must say, the Commission, my former employer, actually did still more than many other councils on this level. But I think we should progress further on this. This is an issue where we can gain a lot.
I will allow one last question from the floor here. Sasha, could you please identify yourself?
Yeah, Sasha Zelenika from the University of Rijeka, one of the pilots in the project. More a few comments than a question. Well, I do agree that we have a fundamental issue or problem with leadership at all levels. And this, unfortunately, cannot be solved by OPUS, or it's a far deeper problem. However, it turns out that somehow it is reflected in the trials that we did, as Claire rightfully identified. On one hand, it's the hardest thing to, or the longer-lasting thing that you can do. On the other, it goes back to some of the things that we mentioned today. On one hand, project-based trials to do something of a very limited breadth. So both time-wise and money-wise. And so you cannot achieve really sustainable results by doing it in this way. And we see this because the Commission throws at you a few million euros out of the billions. You do or try to do something, produce a policy brief, and that's about it. And then it dies with change of leadership or with the end of the project. And so again, it's not really the best or the a sustainable way to do things. But to go back to the basics, as we heard from the panelists, that I sincerely thank for their inputs, because it's, again, light years above the usual discussions that we have in the Commission or next to the Commission. It comes back to the values. And I think we forgot them somewhere along the way, not long ago. Because somehow with the advent of probably internet, when we started to digitalize everything, then we started to have these ranking systems and stuff like this. And then we started to have impact factors and age indexes and so on and so forth. And in this process, we amplified the quantity but lost the quality somewhere along the way. And with it also the the values. So what is it for? I humbly disagree that medicine would be a good example, because in many countries it's the most corrupt system that you can have, with a strong interlinking of private and public interests, and often bullied by pharmaceutical companies, and with billions going nowhere or going in very few pockets. So I wouldn't really think that this is a way to go. Which brings us also to the money. So the big publishers, this is an estimate, but it gives you an idea, have a yearly revenue of 24.8 billion something. If you multiply this by 7, which is a multi-annual framework, you get roughly to 200 billions. So twice the money which is in Horizon Europe goes to the big publishers for the job that we do. So we write the articles, we review the articles, we edit the articles, they earn the money. So we have, again, a structural problem with the values, and it's not easy to, it's not easy to solve. And which then brings us also to this discussion versus the underlying discussion, which really will shape the next policy, which is the new multi-annual framework, where the discussion is completely different. It goes to competitiveness and how to increase it, and how, hopefully, to protect at least bits and pieces of the framework program from competitiveness, to dual use, to security, to I don't know what. So there is no really incentives built in there concerning research assessment, concerning open science, and so on and so forth. It will be a tick box somewhere that you, put that you have a gender equality plan, or that you do comply with open something, and so on and so forth. But again, not more than that. The money will go into something completely different. And up until, again, this drive, a combination of top-down and bottom-up, but mainly bottom-up from especially early career researchers, doesn't come to this level where the money will be distributed, and these are the incentives, these are the rewards. Yeah, I'm afraid that what we are doing here is of a very, very limited breadth. Thank you.
Thank you, Sasha. I'm going to close off the questions. I see there was a very specific question by Shady in the chat, so we'll respond to that in the chat. Before we close, I'd like to ask our panelists to give a last take-home message, what it is we should take with us. Very short, very sweet, please. I'll start with Anna.
I would still like to stay on the positive side, even though it is hard, and there are all kinds of different things that kind of tend to make us think that things will go in the opposite direction of what we want and where we want them to go. But at the same time, I feel that the need for science is huge. And this is where I see people eventually needing to agree on better way of doing science and producing science also for society, because the needs are huge. And I was just at this big conference on financing for development. And for the first time, there was an actual discussion around financing for science, which is rare in financing for development. It's not, these are not, ministries of science there or other funders of science. But the funders of development are looking also into science and to say, okay, we need transformation. Science can bring us transformation. How do we tap into science more? How do we make sure that we get more out of science? So I think some changes we will need to make. And I don't think that, I think the science system will have to reform so that it can also really respond to the needs of society in the now and in the future, particularly because more and more digitalization, AI and all that, it is all based on science. It's not some additional, sector that is there. Eventually, it does all come back to science. So I do think that the things will have to kind of go in the right direction, and I think that we need to, as a community, push in the right direction. Keep pushing for open science. Keep bringing evidence on why this is important, why the research assessment is important, why the values are important. I think we have to be loud now even more than before when things were kind of going in that direction anyways.
Yeah, I think values are key. I think that's the entry point. It's certainly a tricky time. There's a lot of uncertainty. There's a lot of different agendas being pushed on to the research sector. And I think that makes it even more important that we hold on to our values and advocate for those values, of which openness is clearly one. But as we've reflected in this panel, also equality, diversity, inclusion, integrity, autonomy, all of these values as a package. And we use that as a base for pushing for positive change. And we're as loud as we can on those values.
I mean, unsurprisingly, I'm totally going to agree with this. Yeah, I think really critically engaging with the values and thinking about how they are operationalized and how different value-driven actions look in different contexts because they're responsive to their specific contexts, but not letting that make us panic. I think it is really important that enacting equity will look different depending on who you're responding to, where you're responding, and so forth. And I think one thing, the take-home message I would like to have is to recognize that there are already initiatives in place that are really thinking about this. And I'm specifically referring to the Sustainable Development Goals that 3 years ago became accompanied by the Inner Development Goals, which are 5 different sectors: being, thinking, relating, collaborating, and acting. 5 different groups of character traits that you can train around and that you can support in the development of your staff to enable these dialogues, enable these relations, enable these values to be enacted in society. So I think maybe what we need to do is to look to other communities like the IDGs and start thinking about how we can integrate that into our training, how we can integrate that into our leadership, how we can build characters so that we can have this moral consistency across all the different areas of action.
So yeah, okay, then to stay on the positive side, I think yeah, it's maybe now strange to hear from me something positive, but I would say in 2025 we have a situation in which we can more than ever before work openly and share knowledge and data with all the digital tools which we have available. But answering to the question, I think from the researcher perspective, I mean, I would advise researchers indeed to do what I said in my earlier intervention. Good science is open science is science done right, but this also means, and I want to emphasize this a little bit. This institutionalization of mutual responsiveness, don't only look to people who agree with you, but also who don't agree with you and engage in a dialogue, because this is essential for science. And this is what we're lacking in a fragmenting world and where scientists ever know more about less. So it's very important to institutionalize this dialogue across boundaries, nations, and disciplines in science, and so be open to other views. From the government's perspective, obviously this means that we have to incentivize these processes. Means more direct incentives for collaboration, more direct governance interventions on engaging in collaborative missions which are relevant for society, and not well, that's it.
I'm not sure I can be positive. I have to respond to Sasha, because like what Sasha says is absolutely correct. I have to say that if there's one takeaway message that is to be from any panel in these weeks, it is that we have to all go out and engage in the conversation about FP10, and not only FP10 but also about the ERA Act. If anyone wants a really easy starting point to engage your colleagues, there is a petition going around from an initiative from Science Europe. You just sign online, share it with 10 colleagues, and the reason I say that, it is really important that the researcher community, and not just the ECR, early career researcher community, go out and are vocal in these conversations, because often they are quite quiet. And then then nothing happens. If I am to be positive, and I have to finish on a positive note, I think I have to say what I also said in my opening: the OPUS project is a success, and how big a success it will be, and how lasting the effects it will have, will like rely on those of us who has engaged in it. And I think we all have a responsibility to both those who have done the institutional pilots to make them last, but also the other, like us other partners, that we have to take the framework and we have to take it with us to the other conversations we are part of in Quara, in other Horizon Europe projects, and work with it and use it and spread it. So I think I'll close there. Thank you.
So please, let's thank Anna, James, Louise, René, and Pil for the contribution.